Hello! So I have some fun geese here, and I wanted to share some tips for this pattern. So the tricky thing is that when I went to find this pattern online, which I found it on Etsy originally, it is no longer available. The shop is completely gone. So that's kind of a bummer. I have found a couple other patterns that I'm going to link to that are super, super similar. And I think you could make the same basic goose. I think they're maybe slightly smaller in size. And I am also, I think, working on my own goose pattern. But I still wanted to share some of these tips and tricks because the original pattern, I added some things to, like making the neck smaller, adding wings, adding some interfacing, and trying some different materials for the beak and the feet and stuff like that. So if you've purchased this pattern via Etsy, because I shared it before, I wanted to still share these tips and tricks. So this original pattern is by HappyMiniDiy on Etsy. Again, their shop is just completely gone, and so I don't really know what to think about that. But just check out the links that I'll share probably on a blog post of some new goose patterns. Keep an eye out if I decide to do my own goose pattern as well. But there's a handful out there on Etsy. If you even just search goose sewing pattern, there's like 3 or 4 that look super identical. I have purchased one, and it is definitely smaller with a few differences, but super, super similar. So kind of one of my first things that I had to figure out for this goose and a few more that I made is it's a minky-like material, and so I had to add some interfacing to make the neck strong enough to like stay up, because that is one of the tricks with this pattern. So with this specific pattern, I did decrease the neck size, and that I did that by just folding the pattern over about an inch. So it ends up being about an inch shorter than the pattern, the original pattern is. The first one I made looked very flamingo-esque. So, and I mean, it was pink fabric, but it was just quilting cotton, and it had such a long neckline that I decided that I wanted to make the neck shorter. I then added these wings this time around. On the actual pattern itself, I drew out the wing and the shape and the size that I wanted, so I knew the scale, and then I just traced it with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on top of what I drew, because I didn't draw it with the seam allowance. And then I just pillowcased the 2 pieces of wing fabric together with a piece of batting as well. And I just stitched, and then I turned them right side out and closed a little hole and stitched some lines for the wing. And then I sewed those onto the side of the geese before I sewed the geese together. So I'm just showing you here an example of one of the patchwork ones I did. And this one is actually interfaced with SF101, just like the minky one has interfacing SF101 from the head down to kind of where the body starts. It's not the whole thing. But the patchwork one, I interfaced the whole piece for both sides, just because I knew there were a lot of seams and I didn't want anything to come apart, and just to make it slightly thicker. The very first one I made was the flamingo-esque one, and that one felt a little bit floppy to me. You can see it here, how the neck is longer, and so it just makes it appear skinnier, and it has a hard time sitting up. And I like the thicker fabrics for the geese, or to interface the quilting cotton, because the quilting cotton is very cute. But you can see just sitting it there that it's kind of rough with the neck like it is, which if I do my own pattern, that's something I'm going to work on, is the height of the neck and kind of how it sits with the body and stuff. So this one, I also did just a hand stitched eye, which is what the pattern called for. And I ended up changing that on all my geese after that first pink one to a like round fella eye, and I'll show you that later. So this guy is my daughter's. I made for her, and I use like a thicker Shannon Cuddle like fabric, and it's just super floppy. Part of the problem is the stuffing I used for the neck was like a clustery, very soft. Love the stuffing, but it does not work for the neck of these geese. You really need to use a stiffer, like polyester stuffing, just like the really cheap stuff that clumps together. See how his neck just kind of folds. Oh, poor guy. So I did actually open him up and fix his neck. I took out all the body stuffing, and I really packed the stuffing in there with different stuffing for the head and the neck, and then restuff the body. And so you can see me here stuffing. This was my test with the SF101 on the Minky to make sure everything would work okay. And really, the stuffing the body is so easy, but you do have to really get up there and even use a little bit of a dowel or a stick to get the stuffing all the way up into the beak and into the head section, and make that section probably from the beak all the way down to where the neck starts to open up to the body. You really need to stuff it very densely. So I just wanted to share this because I just wanted to show, if you are using a softer fabric like a Minky, or somebody recently mentioned they used a knit and it was a little bit floppier in the neck, that you can just SF101, and even like you'll see here where I trim it. I just started kind of to trim where the body widened out, because mainly you want to just SF101 the main neck part and the head. And I just ironed it on and then trimmed around it to get the right shape. So the only thing I would say, if you have a fabric that's thinner, like this Minky, after I stuffed it, did not show a line where the interfacing was or anything. And so I would test that. Like if you put on a little piece of interfacing and you can see that line through the fabric, you might want to interface the whole thing. Like a knit fabric, you probably would see the line, and potentially a quilting cotton, you might see the line too, which I would recommend. Unfortunately, interfacing a quilting cotton, even, you don't have to, but it's just going to give it more weight. Now, I did use a boucle fabric, which is thicker, almost like a home decor fabric I found on Etsy. And that one was my favorite. I didn't love the color. I had ordered cream, but what came was very beige to me. So I'm going to try ordering an actual cream color. But I liked that thicker fabric the best, and it's still soft on the outside. So if you can find a fabric like that to use, I think that is the most fun, and the like soft but still holds the shape. Because let's be honest, if you're making these for your kids, they're going to grab that goose by the neck a lot. I even do, because it's where it's easiest to grab them. Okay, moving on to sewing. You kind of want to make all the small parts first, which the pattern tells you. The pattern that I used was very clear in construction with pictures and everything, so I did really like it. Right here, I'm making the beak, and one of the changes that I did was I made the beak out of vinyl. So that's like a fun difference. I did try the feet out of vinyl as well, and those didn't quite work out because you have to sew kind of the toes or the webbing onto the feet. And when I did that with my machine, at least, because I don't have a walking foot for the Juki, it like, I don't know, shredded the vinyl as I was going. So if you have a machine that doesn't do that, like top stitching on vinyl, I think you would be fine. Or if you have a special foot or a walking foot. But if you don't have that, for some reason, the feed dogs gripped onto the vinyl and kind of shredded it. And so I had to toss out the feet that I tried this on. So the difference with the vinyl beak is that you are going to sew it wrong sides together, where the pattern with a fabric beak is right sides together. And then you turn it and you do a top stitch around the edge. But for The vinyl, you want the vinyl to be on the outside. You could technically put right sides together, sew it and turn it, but I liked kind of the like little edge that sewing it with wrong sides together gave it. And then you just saw me there. I trimmed the edge so everything was nice and even, and I didn't see the white on the wrong side of the vinyl from any place. So if you're doing fabric, you do clip around that curve before you turn it, and then you're going to top stitch just like the pattern calls for, and have that little ridge as well on the beak. And then when you're sewing them, just remember that the top part of the beak is wider than the bottom part, so it will bubble up a little bit, and you'll have to kind of pivot as you sew at the bottom to get that little bubble so it'll fit properly. So moving on to the feet, this pattern has you sew on like a leg section and to the foot, and I made it the similar color, same color as the actual fabric I was using for the most part. I guess I didn't. I made it just cream. But I did find that on some of the other patterns that I was looking at, and the one I did purchase, that they had the whole foot or webbed foot and like leg all the same color, all one piece of fabric. So that might be a difference if you buy one of these new patterns. I think if I make my own, I'll have the option to make it all one fabric or to change the color. So you have like different legs and different foot fabric, and then you can decide if you want which look you kind of want. So that's just what I was kind of doing here, sewing those all together. And then once they were all sewn, the foot to the leg, I did just pillowcase them just like the pattern calls for, all around the edges. And just to be clear with this, I should have said this at the beginning of the video, you would have to buy this pattern to make it. I'm not sharing the actual pattern pieces because I don't find that ethical, even though the shop closed. And mainly this is for people who have bought the pattern already, or I'm sure some of these tips could work for some of the other patterns. So once I pillowcased all of the feet together, I do clip around the curves. I can't remember specifically if the pattern told you to do this, but for anything curved, I clip little tick marks with my scissors. It goes almost up to the seam, but not quite, every 1/4 inch or so. That helps when you turn it, for those curved like areas to ease, since it's not bias. For any of my patterns, like my pouches or my animals that I've done, you do need to clip the seams. Now, I did actually read something recently that says pinking shears help eliminate this step by cutting that seam allowance with pinking shears after you have sewn it together. And I have not tried that out, but I would be curious to do that next time I make one. And then if anybody has done that, please drop something in the comments and let me know, because I think that would be easier if you're not used to this step, because you do have to be careful not to clip too close or clip through the seam itself. So I do turn all the feet. I use a dowel because it's hard to get things through skinny little sections like those legs, and a dowel, there's also turning tools you can use for this. And then I do use the dowel to help smooth out the seam around the edge. And sometimes if I'm feeling extra, I will iron out that seam around the edge before I stuff them. First though, I do go to do my wings. So when you are sewing your wings together, you just want to put them right sides together, and they're pillowcased. So I realize in this video that I don't have batting on the inside, but for one of my geese, I did do batting. So when I was testing my own pattern, I used quilting cotton, and I put batting in between the layers. So to sew that as a pillowcase, you would still put the two fabrics right sides together, and then you would put the batting behind the bottom piece, on the wrong side of the bottom piece. Sew your pillowcased edge all the way around, leaving an opening for turning. And then when you turn it right side out, pull apart the fabrics between the two exterior pieces, and then open them up and turn them so that the batting ends up on the inside. It's kind of hard to explain in words. Once you visually and actually do it, you'll kind of understand it a little bit better. But if you've never done something like that, you want to remember that your two exterior pieces of the wing are still right sides together touching, and then your batting goes on the back of one of those pieces. So it's going to be on the outside when you're sewing it, and then when you turn it, it will flip to the inside. So I did clip all my curves on the wings as well, and also in that kind of little ditch that you might see as like kind of the bottom of the wing curves up and then comes back down to curve up again and comes back down, kind of in that like indentation. I do clip so that you have a nice smooth edge when you turn it. So if you had batting on this one and you turned it, the batting would flip to the inside. You can use, again, if you need to, a dowel to smooth out all of those edges. And often I do iron as well. Just test your fabric if you're using something different like the Minky or the Boucle, but flattening it out. And then I'm just pinning it kind of together here so it can stay flat and so that I can sew some lines with the sewing machine. And this is similar to how you do the feet when you're in the pattern. You'll understand this, and I'm going to show you the feet in a little bit. But first, I do use a needle and thread to hand stitch that pillowcase hole closed because I want it to look nice and seamless. You could top stitch it closed, but you will see that if you don't top stitch the whole wing, which you could do as well. So here I'm just showing you the stitches that I stitched up from those indentations, maybe like 3 or 4 inches to make the wing look like a wing more. So after you stuff your feet a little bit, you don't want it to be too full, and I typically leave stuffing out from the leg and the top of the foot while I'm doing the stitches for the webbing. You want it kind of to be flatter so that you can easily stitch and have it go underneath your sewing machine. So you're only going to stitch up like 1.5 inches. This is just what the pattern tells you to do. So you start just by kind of putting it in there. We have a little bit different view now, but you just kind of put it under where you want it to start with the needle right at the edge, and you sew that webbing up kind of at an angle. The pattern shows good pictures of this, and it looks like most of the other patterns have a very similar look to them, so I assume that they're going to teach you to do a very similar way. So once you have one done, you can do the other two. So I've done this a couple ways where I've done one down the middle and one down each side, which I'm pretty sure is what the pattern calls for. But then also on my own pattern that I've been working on, I did only do 2, like 1 from each side, and that worked just as well. So you can kind of choose, I guess, if you want to do 1 or 2 or 3 webbings and practice from there. So this is the spot where when I did vinyl feet, it didn't really work because it like scratched up the surface of the vinyl. So if you want to do vinyl feet, definitely make sure you have the right type of foot and practice first before you make a whole foot like I did, or multiple. And then always, my machine clips the threads, but there's always these tiny little 1/4 inch tails that I have to clip off with tiny scissors. So tiny scissors, I would highly recommend for that so you don't clip any of the fabric of the foot. Okay, so your foot is done, and I do like to sew up the top of the leg. I typically stuff it a tiny bit more and then leave the leg pretty much stuffingless because of the way it sits. Having the leg part have no stuffing helps it sit more straight, I guess. And then we're pretty much ready to move on to the body and construction. So I just kind of place my wing on the body and I stitch around that top curve just enough for it to lay flat as it's sitting up. And make sure to backstitch at the beginning and end because little hands will tug at those wings for sure. When I was making the wing, before I pillowcased it, I did sneak my tag in there. So make sure if you have a tag on the underside of the wing, that's a great place to put it, and also to make sure that you put that wing with the tag facing the body so you don't see it. How I do my second wing to get the exact placement is I just lay it on top of my first wing and then lay the body on top of that, and then I can kind of flip it over, but that helps me align the wings in the exact place on either side of the body. You could do it however works for you, but that does tend to work the easiest for me. Once you have the wings on, you're just going to align the head. Definitely use pins if you want to. I don't often use pins. It's one of my downfalls unless I really need to. But you're just going to sew it up how the pattern says, and that's just by sewing from the beak down to the front where there is a pleat, but you're not going to pleat that till later. And you're just using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then you're going to sew on the other side of the beak opening up over the head and back down and around. Remember on the bottom to leave like a 4 or 5 inch opening for you to turn it, and the pattern shares this with you beautifully. To me, sewing the beak on and sewing the webbing on the feet are kind of the hardest part, and they're not really that hard. It's just more like awkwardness. So for the beak, you are going to insert it into that kind of beak hole with the right side facing out of the beak with the right side out. And when you put it into the hole, you have the right sides together. And then I do pin this. I pin at the top and the bottom and in the middle on each side, because you do have the points and the seam of the beak. So it's easy to line up, and those things you do want to be perfectly aligned with the top and the sides and the bottom. And the main reason this is tricky or hard, quote unquote, is because it's such a small hole that as you're sewing it on your machine, you're having to turn and pull out those pins, and it's just a lot going in a small space. But I can do it, and so you can do it. I believe in you. My own goose pattern is probably going to have a very similar construction to this, although I have seen a couple that have a seam down the middle of the beak from like the top middle to the, like the bottom middle. It's kind of like the beak is made up of, some of them are made up of 4 pieces and some are made up of 2, and then you sew it onto either side of the goose, and then you sew the 2 sides of the goose together. It gives you a little bit different shape, in my opinion, from looking at those patterns, but also works. So if you find a pattern like that, don't shy away from it. I think it'll still be very cute. But you can see me here kind of struggling a little bit because it is such a small circumference that I do have to kind of move it a lot, make sure things are aligned, recheck everything. So just go slow, take your time, and readjust if need be. My biggest tip here after you sew the beacon is to double check all your seams, because you're going around in a circle and things are kind of shifting. You want to make sure that on both sides you catch all of those pieces of fabric. So if you don't, like I did not get a big enough seam allowance here, I'm just going to kind of start back before it got too small and scooch it in a little bit, maintaining kind of the same curve that you are, but just make sure that you have caught enough fabric on both the beak and the goose body all the way around before you turn it. Because if you don't, it would have a bigger tendency to create a hole or bust a seam. So moving on to the bottom, you have this pleat that was cut, and that's where your legs from your feet go. So you kind of insert them into the pleat. And I like to make sure that the legs are sewn across the top so that they stay kind of aligned properly. And then I typically like to pin them. I've found that if I don't pin them, which I can't remember if I did or didn't in this video, but if I pin them, they stay aligned better. And then another tip here is to make sure, because this is a pleat, so the edges are just folded over. When you sew across the whole thing, make sure you have a big enough seam allowance. Again, you want to check this after to make sure that every piece of fabric on both sides of those legs and the back and front of the goose got caught in the seam allowance, and there's enough seam allowance, but you also want to go and backstitch over top of the fold on either side, because as you kind of go out, you're going to lose fabric because it's at an angle here. It's kind of hard to explain until you make it, but just make sure that you are taking that seam all the way out to the edge. And I even go like 1 stitch past and then past the edge and then backstitch back and forth. Especially if you're making this for a child, You want to reinforce those seams as much as possible. A smaller stitch length is really great. Just make sure that you have a very strong construction before you turn it, because you don't want any of those seams to pop. If you have a serger, this is a great time to use a serger. And if you don't have a serger, if you have time, another way to ensure that you have strong seams is to just sew your seam with the recommended seam allowance, and then sew another seam just slightly inside from that towards the seam allowance, maybe like a 1/16 of an inch. That way, if your first seam ever pops, it'll open up to that second seam and you'll still be fine. They do that a lot actually in clothing construction. Men's suit pants, I believe, are done that way a lot. And it just helps ensure that it is a strong seam in case it ever pops. So you can see after you sew those legs in, you are ready to turn it. And that's a fun part. Getting that head out the neck is a little bit tricky, but you can use your fingers, dig in there, or you can go in from the inside and push it out. It is really satisfying to see it come out and be a full goose. So I do sew my eyes on after the fact. I use about 1/2 inch black felt circle, and I just whip stitch those on because I like to place them after it's stuffed. I do believe you could put them on before you sew the goose together, so just keep that in mind. And I believe this pattern that I use does call for hand stitching them. I wasn't really sure what I was doing in the last part of that video, but probably clipping some like stray threads or something. I am stuffing the goose now. If you're confident in your construction, you don't have to treat this fabric goose assembly any like lightly or anything. Just go for it. My biggest recommendation always on all seams is do a back stitch at the beginning and end to lock those seams in place. And sometimes I do a double back stitch over where the opening is to stuff it. I tend to put a bunch of stuffing in, and then I put my hand in the goose and start to shove it up towards the neck and the beak, because you do need quite a bit up there and you need to kind of push it all together up towards the top. Don't be shy. It's going to kind of start to clump up, but just push and push. And after you get a big clump up into the head section, you're probably going to have to scrunch the neck up a little bit to kind of rotate it into the beak, because you do want to fill that beak too. The beak does keep its shape pretty decently, even without too much stuffing in it, because one of my geese, I did not get a ton of stuffing in the beak and it still is okay. But I would recommend getting as much stuffing into that beak as possible. And you can also use, like I said, a dowel for this. Once you get a bunch of stuffing up into that head, you can kind of use the dowel to like angle it into the beak if you need. So just keep that in mind. There's lots of stuffing tools, but my mom always used a dowel, so that's what I have always used. She taught me how to sew, so I have never really used any of those fancy stuffing tools, but they probably work. And then another tip is just to stuff the neck and the head and the beak as tight as possible. Like, I know we want a soft stuffed animal, a soft goose to cuddle, but getting that neck and that beak area really stuffed is really important, because that is what helps it keep its shape. And then you can more loosely stuff the body so it is soft to the touch for whoever this is for. Just make sure with whatever your fabric using, like you saw my hand there kind of grabbing at the front of the goose, there is a little bit of a wrinkle. You want to make sure that you put enough stuffing for it to be nice and smooth. Okay, so here I am cutting a black felt eye, and I did measure it after I got the right side, and it's about 1/2 inch. This was a little bit big, but until I measured it, I just kind of eyeballed it, pardon the pun, and you can see that's definitely too big. It looks more like a pigeon eye, but all you have to do is kind of cut a circle to basically the right size, and then you can stitch them on. And I, of course, trimmed this down until I got the right size, and then I whip stitched around the eye to get it on. And then once you get the right sizing for your eye, it's really as simple as just whip stitching it into place. I put the one eye on one side and I use just black cotton, like aurifil type thread, and I stitch around the whole exterior of it in a whip stitch style. And once I have the one eye done, I actually pull my needle through to the other side and I make sure that eye is aligned as close to symmetrical as I can. I usually just eyeball it on the side and then I face the goose towards me and make sure they look level and about the same distance back from the beak, and then I whip stitch around the second eye and I knot my thread and bury it under the eye. And that is how you get the eyes on if you decide to sew them on after. So that's kind of how you make the geese from that existing pattern that no longer exists anymore. I'm so sorry. Like I said, I hope a lot of these tips can help you with other patterns, and I'm really hoping to get my own pattern done. This was my first attempt at it. It's similar, of course, because they had a genius construction, and looking at all the other geese pattern, I definitely think they're all the same, but I am trying to work and figure out a little bit better shape on the front so that it sits better, so to speak. So mine sits better than the other ones, but I don't love, of course, this little bump. And I actually really am not super sure about the tail either. I'll show you the difference. Let's put another one over there. Sorry, I am moving all around. But I also wanted to pull these out because I wanted to tell you. So he does sit fine, but sometimes you have to like wiggle with him, where I feel like this one that is the first rendition of my own pattern, you just plop it down and it sits nicely. The other thing I wanted to share is if you decide to add any fun embellishments, like on a lot of mine, I put a patch on the bottom. Oh no, you can see over here that if you want to do that patch, do it before you sew the two sides of the geese together. And then this one is my Halloween guy. I just drafted this mask by holding a piece of paper curved over his face and putting where his eyes was. And then I cut it out just out of black felt, added a ribbon because of the shape of his head. You have to tie it around his neck. And he has Halloween feet and then the black cat on his bottom. And this is just a look at the boucle as well, which I was talking about. It's a very soft fabric, but has a nice weight to it. And I'm going to try and get it in the white and see if that's more of like a cream. You can see my other guys. There's geese all over here hanging out up there. His neck was fixed, so that's really awesome. But I hope this video helps you if you were able to purchase the pattern. If you didn't purchase that pattern and wanted to wait for mine, I'm hoping in the next week or two. Or you can take a look at Etsy. There's several patterns on Etsy. I was just doing a search and I will show you, and I will try to link it too. This is the one that I did purchase, but it is smaller than, it's by Joe Bucco on Etsy. It is smaller than these guys, and it is definitely different. It's very, very similar construction, but it has some different shapes to it. The legs and feet are different, so just keep that in mind. But as you can see, I did just do a search. I did actually try to find the shop. Again, HappyMiniDiy, but goose sewing pattern on Etsy. That one comes up. There's a bunch of the cute ones like that are more flat for babies. And then there's this guy. We go down, there's these three. So there are a few. So definitely don't feel like you have to wait for my pattern if you weren't able to snag the one that I am making in this video.